when they pass out those little cups, by the way, and they send those around, that's not to pour on yourself like I did, just so you know, okay? And if we ever get to vote on whether or not we continue with those little plastic things, or we actually go back to the old the little, I'm going to vote for the latter, and not for those things. I left here thinking I'd run home and change shirts, right? And pants too, for that matter. But then I thought, hey, we live 35 minutes away. I will not make it back in time to get this thing started. So here I am. Just put up with me, okay? What can I say? My kids used to have a lot worse eating habits than that in terms of what they got on them. All right, so today we're going to be looking back at the story of the birth and early years of God's man, Moses. We set the scene in the last quarter. God created the world. God created the Jews. God's providence of his nation is clearly seen, but the Jews have wandered away over time. God sent them prophets, God sent priests, and God ordained certain people, ordinary people, to speak to the chosen nation of Israel. The people didn't listen. But perhaps the most important Jewish ambassador of God we'll be talking about, and that is Moses. Every spring since their beginning, the Jews have celebrated Passover, right? If you have friends, you know that's a big deal for them. It's like Christmas for us. Passover is for them. Even today, it's a highlight of their year and one of the most festive times for them. For the Jews, what does Passover celebrate? What does it celebrate? The Exodus, the exit from Egypt by the children of Israel by night. Well, the word that they use is P-E-S-A-C-H, and that's pronounced Pesach. So if you ever get invited to a Jewish Pesach, that means a Jewish Passover celebration. And it celebrates God passing over the homes of the Israelites the night before they left for Canaan. And they did an interesting thing. They spread blood over the door frames, right? Well, today, Passover represents a remembrance of this particular miracle in the Jews' existence. The Bible says at the time the Jews spent in Egypt, most of it in slavery was 430 years. Exodus 12:40. Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. And on that day, God came and killed the Egyptian infants, really infants of any nation, not just the Egyptians, but any nation, even the Israelites who did not have blood smeared over the tops of the doors in their homes. Finally, the monarch of Egypt allowed the group to leave under Moses. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. Because even all of the ones that were out there reporting back that they lost their children, he also lost a son. Every year, Jews all over the globe serve a meal that includes a boiled egg, crackers, similar to what we partake, crackers, walnuts and wine and some bitter herbs. And all of this reminds them of the hardship that they were under all the years while they were in servitude in Egypt. And also then to remind them, of course, of the angel that passed over their own homes and left their infants living. If any of you have a Jewish friend who invited you to Pesach at their homes in the spring, this year, coming in 2022, it will begin on tax day, April the 15th. That will be their Pesach. So the question is, if you look at the Bible and you ask yourself, how long was Israel in Egypt? You have two choices. They were either there 430 years, as some scriptures, as you can see here, clearly say, or they were there for 400 years. If the Bible is never wrong or inconsistent, how do you reason this discrepancy? Well, how would you tell someone who came to you and said, look at your Bible, they don't have it right. It's wrong in one place and not wrong in the other. 400 or 430, what would you say? Why? That's probably what I would say too. I would just look at them and think, why are you asking me that question?
Could it be an estimate or a rounded off number?
And it's not a matter of rounding. It's not an estimate. These are very specific dates. If I told you something lasted for 2 hours, what does that mean? That it started 2 hours ago from when I'm talking to you, right? Well, in the case of 400 and 430, which is what you find in these verses, it would mean that 400 started a little bit later and 430 started earlier, right? It has to do with the starting point in time, and that's how you can rectify and justify these two numbers. Now, I got to tell you folks, when I was putting these lessons together, I spent a couple of days working just on this chart, trying to get the things lined up exactly as they were with all of the people who were involved here. And the white lines represent times and years. You can see it goes from 4 to well over 430. And then the white lines that are in there represent a person. For instance, the very top line represents Abraham's life and the events that occurred in Isaac's life and Jacob's life and Joseph and finally Moses. So they're all laid out there and they're all in the right, as far as I can tell, chronological sequence according to time. The years they spent in Egypt would be 400 years from when Ishmael taunted Isaac. 400 years from the time that they started being opposed by others who were not of their nationality. Or it's 430 years from the promise of Abraham that he would have a son named Isaac. And it's also then 215 years from Jacob's entry into Egypt. So these clearly explain the discrepancies in dating and the duration, and explain why some places say 400 and some say 430. So I know you'll forget it just like I did, and I had to be reminded of it when I came back to this slide looking at it the second time I've taught this class. But at any rate, there is a discrepancy there, and if anybody ever asks you that question, just give me a call and I'll walk them through it if you can't remember. Early on, the Israelites in Egypt were given respect, of course, from Pharaoh, weren't they? Pharaoh gave them the respect they needed. He was clearly impressed with Joseph, and he brought him in even into his own group as a person working for him in the palace that he lived in. The Jews were brought to Egypt and given what they thought to be fertile land up in Goshen. And over time, as they grew in number, though, fear stepped in. Pharaoh began to distrust them. Eventually, the group was oppressed from fear that they might revolt and that they might make it hard for the Israelites would have a war with them. Israelite slavery in Egypt was a period of about 400 years. Can you think of another time where a people were oppressed for 400 years? But believe it or not, it's very similar to an event that we experienced in our own life here in America. Of course, that would be 400 years of slavery. The period of black servitude and slavery in America, in 1619, a ship with 20 captives landed at Point Comfort in Virginia and ushered in the era of American slavery. And from the first slaves brought into North America in the 1600s to the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation by President Lincoln was about 263 years. Slavery lasted for about 263 years, technically. But inequality on all levels between whites and blacks and between what used to be slaves and free people was the rule of the law for the next 200 years. For instance, by the 1960s, 21 states in the United States, most of them, of course, in the South, still had laws in place that prohibited a white person from marrying a black person. It was illegal. Alabama was the last state to repeal that law, by the way, and that was in the year 2000. So truly, it represents the freedom from slavery and the inequality of blacks and whites in a great novel way. And that was a total of about 400 years. 400 years of slavery, 400 years of oppression, if you will. So how many Jews came with Jacob? How many Jews came with Jacob when he left that land and went down to Egypt? 7? 70, okay. 70 is a good guess, but if you read Acts chapter 7, you would know it was 75. Now, is that a discrepancy? Is that a place where the Bible is wrong? Well, clearly we have to kind of understand that, right? Well, here's what 75 represents. 70 represents the descendants of Jacob. But the 75 represents the descendants of Jacob, but don't count Jacob and Joseph. We're talking about the people that came after them, and throw in the 9 sons of Jacob. Add all that together, and you wind up with 75. So there's the discrepancy and explanation for it. But nonetheless, we're talking about a group of people that started with only 70 people when they actually came in. Now, another set of discrepancies exists regarding how long their stay was in Egypt. In 2 cases, it's set at 400 years, and in 2 cases, the Bible records it to be 430 years. Is the Bible wrong? Why can't there ever be, in these numbers, I mean, obviously that's inconsistent, right? Someone could point to that and bring it to you and put it on your kitchen table and ask you to explain the difference. When you get your Bible right, then I'll start believing it. Well, how would you handle that? Is the Bible wrong? Was it 400 or 430 years? Well, if you're looking at dates and duration, you have to consider it had a start time and an end time, right? And their stay in Egypt was different depending upon the start date. Do you consider it from the time of Abraham all the way to the Exodus? Or do you consider it the time from Isaac all the way through the Exodus? And of course, you get 430 or 400 depending upon what you choose. Now, we know the end of the story about the life of the Jews in Egypt, right? We haven't even talked about it. We'll start doing that next week. But you know the end of the story, right? Eventually, they're going to leave Egypt, aren't they? Moses comes along. He leads them home on a rather long journey. And this picture, I love this picture, but it shows what happens on the day before they left. This was them piling all of their goods in wagons and getting them all together and getting ready to leave, and showing a great number of people that were leaving there. How many people left Egypt? How big were the Jews at that time? Was it 70 people? Clearly more than 70, right? Millions? A bunch, okay. Would you think it's 1 million people?
Should be or more.
Well, Exodus tells us the census that was given at the start of this counted 600,000 men. Now, that did not include women and children, and so we really technically don't know. There were 600,000 people on foot according to Numbers, but in Numbers chapter 41, we're talking about men who were 20 plus and able to go to war, about 600,000. So, depending upon how you label who these people were, whether they were men or war-ready men or men and women, you'd get a different number there. At the Jordan River, there were only 601,000 men who were ready to cross over and come into the area. So we're talking about 600,000 men, but you also then have to account for women and children, don't you? Well, a good estimate then would be something like 1 to 2.5 million if you include men and women. We can't know for certain. There's no way to know. But you can make some reasonable guesses. 1 to 2.5 million, including men and women. But that still doesn't include children. We're talking about a huge number here, folks, when you start thinking about it. At Sinai, we know that the census was taken, right? And there were 603,000 war-ready men over 20 years old in this group. Now, if you just assume a 1-to-1 ratio of men to women, which is probably a pretty good guess, right? Ignoring children, don't forget God made them extra, what do you call it, prolific, extra fecund is the word actually, fecund. They were having children right and left and by the time they got ready to leave. You'd wind up with 1.2 million without children. If you add 1 child in there, you'd have 1.8 million. If you add 2 children in there, you'd have 2.4 million. And if you add 3 children there, you would have 3 million people. 3 million people. How big is 3 million people? Would 3 million people fit in our stadium? Our state's about 3 million? Okay. The whole state of Arkansas. Have you ever seen that many people gathered together? No? I got some pictures for you. Just hang on. But before we go to those pictures, think about this. It had to be a large number because God's going to take away quite a few of them. God's going to kill quite a few of them. In effect, he kills 3,000 Levites at the golden calf. Those Levites are killed, 3,000 of them. 23,000 were killed later then by God at the golden calf. 14,000 are going to be killed in Kadesh Barnea later in a plague. 24,000 were killed in Shittim. And many snakes by the river Zered killed quite a few in numbers. Altogether, a total of about 65,000 people who were killed. 65,000 people. So some left, 65,000 were taken care of by God in events that occurred because of their wickedness and what they did. There had to be a large number of people who left if God's going to take away over 500,000 of them. Well, I've never been to Rio de Janeiro, and I guess I'd like to go sometime, but I would not like to go there during the festival that they have every year in the spring. This is a picture of Rio de Janeiro, and if you look at it from a map and you look down on it, this beach that we're seeing is in a great big huge circle. It's almost like a pond, but really it's the ocean coming in. It just goes around almost in a semicircle there. So it is a huge landmass, and we're only looking at one small part of it here. And the number of people that you see here in this picture is going to be about 3 million. And we're talking about 2 million Jews. That's about how big this would have been, these people leaving Egypt. And I always think about just a handful of them, but man, it was a lot. It was a lot of people. And over a period of about 400 years, the question I had is, in my mind, could the Jews possibly grow from 70 or 75 to over 2 million people? Is it possible in 400 years they could grow to over 2 million people? Now, on the surface, the argument sounds questionable, right? But do the numbers really support that kind of argument? And this is the kind of question that intrigues me. It bugs me. I will live with this question forever until I wind up with an answer, because it comes in my mind and will not leave. This image comes from President Barack Obama's swearing-in ceremony. This happened back in the year 2009. 1 million people gathered together in a pretty small area there. If you've ever been there, you know what it is. It goes from one end to the other. You can see way away there, and we're looking at it here. That is over, well, quite a few million people there. But that's really, how many did I say? 1 million. Yes, 1 million people.
But Butch, you can double the population in 20 years. Double.
Okay.
I mean, it's, you know, the law of large numbers, just like having children.
Well, let me tell you about that. If you're looking here, it's a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Must. They hold the world record for having the largest number of offspring, largest number of 2 people who live, and at the time they were living, they had the largest number of offspring. They lived both to be 96 years old, and when they died, they had over 800 living descendants. One couple had over 800 living descendants in just being 96 years old. Over 3 generations, their family output included 97 grandchildren, 638 great-grandchildren, and they have the world record for having the most living descendants. Now, these are numbers. These are actually true experience here. The question that came to my mind when I saw this was, is it possible for us to take their statistics, which is what you were talking about there, and see how many offspring they might have after 450 years? Guess what? Again, I spent a lot of time with the calculator and a lot of time with Excel, and I put this together. And I tried to explain it to Jenny. She got it, I think. She got most of it. So I'll work over it with you here. There are 15 rows, so we're talking about 15 generations. Now, that generation is you had a child. You lived, the child lived, 2 generations. We're talking about generations here, okay? Over 15 generations of people. At the start, there would have only been Mr. and Mrs. Must, right? And the population there would be 2. And then on the first row, 2 people, they had 11 births and they had 12 marriages between them. So they had 11, they brought 2 more children in with them, if you will. I guess you'd consider in-laws children. And there were 11 births in that first generation, plus the spouses, so the total at the end of the first full year was 24, as you can see here. The first generation and the first generation was 24, was a total number of 24. So if the birth rate then of the musts were applied to the nation of Israel, there would have been a total of 24 Israelites at the end of year 1. And the birth rate of 4.5 per family would apply to that group during year 2. And at the end of year 2, they would have had 724 births of Israelites. And at the end of year 3, they would have 1,500 and something. And the number continues to grow because, of course, their population is growing. But you also have to account for deaths. And this whole little chart here does that. If I took a long time with the other chart, I took a lot longer with this chart to figure it all out. You have to account for things like you see in purple there. A generation comes in and a person will live probably 3 generations if he's lucky. So we'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say 3 generations, right? Well, if you had 1,000 or 14,539 come in one generation, 3 years later, 14,539 go out of that number. They're no longer here. So it accounts for a lot of different things there, but it does calculate a number that at the end of 15 generations, Mr. and Miss Must would have 3,342,000 children or descendants just of their own. So it is possible, clearly, for the numbers that we read about there to be very logical.
I don't recall why I did it, but I did something similar 100 years ago with wheat.
With wheat?
Wheat.
Okay.
You take 2 grains of wheat.
All right.
In 30 years, you feed the world for 1 day.
In 30 years.
Yes.
Wow.
It's God's wonderful law of multiplication. Multiplication, not addition.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just amazing.
Well, until I saw that, I always thought God had to do something extraordinarily special to make it happen. But he didn't. He gave us birth rates and he gave us population growth, and he let things go. And just from the people who left Egypt, clearly he had enough people then to satisfy the argument about how many folks came over. So, any questions about that? Any comments or snotty remarks or anything? No? Well, moving on from that technical stuff, who was the Pharaoh at the time of Joseph? Do you know who the Pharaoh was? Who was the Pharaoh at the time of who didn't know Joseph? Because one Pharaoh loved him. The next Pharaoh that came in didn't even know him. It was like, who is this guy? They brought these Israelites in here and they're just a plague on our nation. It's kind of how he looked at it. And then there was a Pharaoh of oppression or opposition. And then there was a Pharaoh of the Exodus. It wasn't just one Pharaoh from the time of Moses. There were 4 of them in the picture here that really, over that period of time, were the significant ones. We are not very clear about who the Pharaohs were at the times that are mentioned in the book of Genesis. You couldn't pick any one out and say it was this Pharaoh, because the timelines are just not given in the Bible, and you can't equate that to actual history. So it's difficult for us to really know, but people have made guesses. And the Pharaoh of Joseph generally comes down to one of 2 choices. Thutmose III and his wife Hatshepsut, I can't even pronounce it, Hatshepsut. And then perhaps Pharaoh Amenophis III. I'm brutalizing these names. This first Pharaoh listed on the left there could have been the one that gave Jacob the area around Ramses in the land of Goshen as a place to live. Or it could have been the second one that's shown there as well. Now, incidentally, if you ever want to win a bet with somebody, ask them, were there ever any female pharaohs? What's the answer going to be? Yes. Were there female pharaohs? Well, you and I may know that there was one, but for the most part, general people would know. They would say, no, pharaohs have always been men, and they always were men. Well, that's not necessarily true. I see this picture of Tai. She never was a pharaoh, but there will be one who, when her husband dies, she takes off his beard. It's not really ever, it's just a fake beard that he wore anyway. And she took that beard and put it on and wore it and became the first woman pharaoh of Egypt. And I have her name here somewhere, but I can't. Oh, it's Hatshepsut. She did that, and she is considered a pharaoh even though she was a woman. So, an interesting thing. Well, who was a pharaoh who didn't know Joseph? The one that came in after the original pharaoh that gave Joseph all the preference? Who was that pharaoh? Well, we're not quite sure. Some people suggest that it's perhaps Seti, Pharaoh Seti the First. He could have been the pharaoh following the story of Joseph, the one who didn't know Joseph personally. And this is the pharaoh we are more familiar with, of course, because of Boris Karloff playing him as the mummy. And that would have been the same pharaoh then, in some cases, of the one who didn't know Joseph at that time. And the pharaoh of depression, again, because they haven't really tied it down. Folks, they haven't even found where they live over there yet with a great degree of consensus. So it's likely that the pharaoh of the oppression was Ramses II. And he was the one that put the Israelites to work making bricks. Now, in his youth, I think he looked a lot better than he did in his mummified form. And I think he looked quite a bit like Yul Brynner myself. What do you guys think?
Looks pretty good for 3,000 years old.
I know it. I tell you, I hope I'll look that good someday. Here are a couple of possibilities of the Pharaoh that you read about during the Exodus. This is the Pharaoh that would have been the one who had his own son die, or sons die, that night that they got ready to leave. Now, either of these two could have been the Pharaoh of the Exodus. He could have been the one that said, "Let my people go." Moses told to let my people go, but we don't know. We do not know which one of these, or maybe there was another one that we just don't know about. Just remember that God promised Abraham and Jacob that their nation would be as numerous as the stars, right? But he also warned them that they were going to be afflicted. In other words, it's not going to all be sunshine and stars at night. It's going to be thunder showers. It's going to be lightning.
You talked about hyperbole last week, I believe. Hyperbole?
Hyperbole? Okay.
I think that is.
Mm-hmm.
It's not.
It's not.
It is the stars,
Okay.
but it's a bunch.
It's going to be large. It just meant a large number.
These folks lived before Noah and before the new well.
Well, so they can.
You can only, at any given night, you only see a little over 3,000 stars.
Yeah.
Well, but I'm not right. Isn't it hyperbole?
Well, I don't know. He could have seen a night like this, I suppose. I don't know.
Purpley or
Hyperbole is a good word for that. Hyperbole, yeah.
it's probably like she said,
Hyperbole. Okay. Well, the first affliction of the Jews happened sometime after Joseph's death. So Joseph lived, and when Joseph died, the really oppression that started was probably right at the end of his life when he died. A Pharaoh arose who didn't know the Israelites, and he only saw them as mere work animals, right? And many speculate this was Ramses the Great. Eventually, the group of Palestinians in Egypt were viewed with suspicion and deemed unworthy of appreciation or gratitude. And the Egyptians noted how plentiful they were, and they worried about what might happen if there were a war. Here's an image of a normal work day in the life of the Israelites, right? What happens when I go to work? Well, when I get up in the morning and go to work, it looks something like this. The Egyptians' plan was to work them like cattle. Taskmasters were placed over them. The Israelites helped build the storehouses for grain. They made brick and mortar buildings from scratch, and they would become the major workforce in Egypt over time. The first plan, though, when the Pharaoh got to worrying that there were too many of them, we need to take care of this problem we have with these Egyptians, Israelites. But that plan that he put in place didn't work, right? The Israelites were hard workers. They were told to go out and work them to death. But you couldn't work them to death. They even worked harder. So at the time of Moses' birth, another plan was hatched. The plot was, kill all the baby boys. That'll take care of our problem. And the baby girls would be allowed to live. So he instructed the midwives to kill the baby boys. But the midwives had a problem. The midwives came back and said, we tried to do that, but by the time we get to the houses, those Israelite women have popped those babies out. And we didn't get to do anything to them. So all the Egyptians then were commanded, when you find Egyptian or Israelite babies, throw them in the Nile. That was a Hebrew. We're commanded to throw newborn baby Hebrew boys into the Nile. So to have a newborn was a risky proposition, right? Everybody was on alert for pregnant Jewish men, Jewish women who were walking around. And again, my mind went off on a tangent, and I got to wondering, how many Jewish families live in Egypt today? Really, they were trying to do ethnic cleansing back at this point in time. They're going to work them to death until we got rid of the Israelite problem that we have. Has ethnic cleansing happened in Egypt? I was thinking there would be only a few thousand Israelites that lived in Egypt, right? How many Jews do you think live in Egypt today? Well, I can tell you, as I did the research. There are only 18 Jews living in Egypt today. This is from a reputable source. Now, this was in 2017. The number today is even less than 18. Talk about ethnic cleansing. I mean, what they were hoping to have happen has actually happened, hadn't it, from their nation. This article was published by the Jerusalem Post in 2019, and it starts off there saying, when this one famous lady died over there, that left 5 Jews known to be living in all of Cairo. Only 5 in the whole city of Cairo. So back to the story of the birth of Moses. Jochebed found herself pregnant. She and her husband were certainly hoping for a girl. So when they saw it was a boy, they were very distressed. Jochebed kept the newborn hid from everyone for 3 months. And I often wondered, how in the world was that possible? We lived in apartments when our babies were little. Everybody in the surrounding apartments knew we had a baby in our house. So today we would give them a video game system and tell your neighbor and tell them to keep quiet, or your neighbors would never see them again. But as Moses grew up, it became increasingly hard to keep his presence secret, too hard to conceal them, because their fear was so great. So they had a daring plan that they put in place, a desperate plan. Jochebed made a basket from papyrus, coating it with tar and pitch. And Noah did the same thing many years later with wooden beams when he made his boat. And here's a little bit of trivia in case you didn't know. Pitch means it's like tar, except it's in liquid form. And it'll always stay in liquid form. It'll never dry up. Well, it might dry up, but it stays in liquid form. Tar, on the other hand, will eventually dry up and turns into a really hard and brittle piece. So if you threw a blob of tar down, a solid tar on the concrete, it's going to break into tons of pieces, right? But if you mix the two together, guess what you get? Silly putty. I mean, technically, it stays in a putty form and it works, and it'll always be there. Well, that's what she used. She used a combination of tar and pitch and coated the inside of that basket, and so it floated. Jacob had placed the baby Moses in a boat along the reeds, and of course Pharaoh's daughter came along later taking a bath and spotted the boat, and she heard a baby crying on the inside. And she said, "It's a Hebrew baby." Now quick thinking Miriam, who was watching nearby, said, "You want me to go find a Hebrew woman to take care of him?" And she rushed home, of course, to bring Jochebed back. And Jochebed nursed Moses until he was weaned and then took him to the princess to raise. Moses was given an Egyptian name, Mose, M-O-S-E, which means to draw out, because he was drawn out of the water. Moses' name appears in many Egyptian names, like Thutmose, Ramses. Moses is even in that. The Egyptian princess may have been Hatshepsut, the only surviving child of Pharaoh Thutmose, who we saw a picture of earlier. Now we know Moses grew up in that royal family. He was also educated in that royal family. He was a well-educated leader by the time he took over. He knew math, he knew history, he knew science, he knew a lot of things that they were teaching in that the normal Jew would not know. But he always knew, I'm different. I'm not like my brothers and sisters. I am completely different from them. Probably he was told the story of how he came to be and finding a little baby in a basket. One day he was out, and it says he was visiting his own people, so he knew he was Hebrew. His own people. He watched in anger. An Egyptian taskmaster, of course, mistreated the Jew, and Moses came to the unfortunate Jew's aid and kills the Egyptian, and then he hid the body. And then he's got a problem. What if they find out? What are they going to do to me? And of course, he had to get away. But not only that, what came as a surprise to him was the next day when some Jews saw him, they said, "Hey, there's that man Moses. Hey, Moses, did you come to kill us like you did that Egyptian yesterday?" Moses knew he was in trouble. And if he was spotted on the streets, the Israelites would tell on him, you know. So he had to do something to get away. And of course, he escaped to Midian. Moses escaped to Midian. Why Midian? Well, if you're going to leave Egypt, that's the safest place to go and probably the closest community of any kind, because everybody else that wandered around down there were just nomads. They had a family and a few people, but they were all together as family units and not as any cities. Midian was the first place he came to. Midian was the son of Keturah. Remember, Abraham had a wife that nobody liked because she was a different color? That was Keturah. And the Midianites were descendants of her and Abraham, really kind of cousins, if you will, to the Jews. There's evidence that the Midianites worshiped the God of Abraham, though it's likely they were predominantly idol worshipers. Anyway, the Midianites were the one who bought and sold Joseph earlier, if you remember that in our story. So Moses goes down to Midian. The first thing he sees at a well outside the city, similar to what Jacob saw when he went over to a different country, was a group of women who had come there to water their sheep. And the shepherds who were there were trying to drive those daughters of Jethro away. He defended them. He watered their flocks. And when Jethro found out, he invited Moses to a barbecue. I cannot help this, but every time I hear the word Jethro, I think of Jethro Bodine. I'm sorry, but I just do. Anyway, Moses had a barbecue given in his honor, and he married Zipporah, who gave birth to Moses' son Gershom. Gershom means, I'm a foreigner. How would you like to name your kid Foreigner? You know, hey, foreigner, come here. Back in Egypt, while Moses was in Midian with Jethro, Pharaoh died, and a new Pharaoh took office. The Israelites' fate worsened. They groaned under the burdens that were placed on them, the work that they had to do. And God remembered his children, the children of Abraham, and he was concerned about them in Midian. Moses begins to think, I probably ought to return to see how things are going with my brothers over there. And he begins packing for his trip. And that's where we will end our lesson today, and we'll pick that up with Moses' life, part 2, next week, if you will. Thank you very much, folks.
Thank you.
I'm sorry?
I said thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.